What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you've been enjoying the content lately. A couple of days ago, I posted a video talking about the best top line centers in the NHL, ranking them in a tier list based on whether or not I think they're capable of leading their team to a Stanley Cup. Well, today, since you guys enjoyed that content so much, I have the next best thing. We're going to be ranking the best second line centers in the NHL, sort of on the exact same premise. So here are the tier lists that I have today. The first one should be a first line center, second line center capable of driving a Stanley Cup caliber second line, third tier good but not elite, fourth on the rise, fifth good player, fringe third line center, and then the final one, not a second line center. Now these are the players that I have for this list today. If you guys have been enjoying the content lately and you want to support the channel, make sure you hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel. It'll let you know whenever I post fun new content like this, and let's get right into it. All right, let's start off this list with Trevor Sire of the Anaheim Ducks. This one's a little bit tough. Obviously, Sire has the potential to be a top line center for almost every organization in the league, but we're not really sure what his ceiling is going to be. He put up that 60+ point year a couple of seasons ago, and then this past year he was hurt for the majority of the year, so we really didn't get a good idea on whether or not he's going to be able to take that next step as a player. I think the perfect tier to describe him right now is being capable of driving a second line for a Stanley Cup winning team. I'm not sure if he should be a top line center. I guess we just have to wait and see where his potential takes him. So I think this is the perfect spot to play Sire right now. Obviously, the potential is there, the talent's there, but we just need to see a little bit more, and of course, he needs to stay healthy. Next up, we have Logan Couture coming off a pretty good rookie season. I think the perfect tier for him is on the rise. Obviously, we could place him higher. I think eventually he's going to be a very, very good second line center and potentially a really good first line center. But with what we know today, I don't think that we can justify placing him any higher. Obviously, let's see how he plays in his sophomore year, but after a promising rookie season, I think he definitely belongs in the on the rise tier. Next up, we have Coyle of the Boston Bruins. I'm going to place him in the good but not elite tier. I think when we're talking about Coyle, he does have a pretty high ceiling. He showed us last year that he's capable of taking on a bigger role for an organization if he's asked, but I think the best spot to put Coyle is on the third line, where he's going to get the better of the matchups that he faces on a night in, night out basis, rather than placing him on a first or second line. But I do think he's capable of being a very good second line center, especially if you place some nice pieces around him. Obviously, Boston has been able to do that, placing guys like Brad Marchand on his wing, which is going to make him look a lot better than maybe he actually is. But when it comes to good second line centers, I think Coyle is the perfect definition of that. So I'm going to place him in this tier. Good, but not elite. Still a great player. That doesn't mean there's any knock on his game. Next up, we have Dylan Cozens. I think this is exactly the same as Coyle. They both have the potential of maybe a greater ceiling, but when you look at their game in totality, I think that they're both just very good centers. They're not these first line guys. They could be third line guys, just kind of on that fringe line. I really like Dylan Cozens' game. I think that he's a quality guy for the Buffalo Sabres, and if they have Tage Thompson playing at his best, I think that the team is capable of having a deep Stanley Cup playoff run if they could just put everything together. He, just like Coyle, belongs in this tier. I wouldn't place him any higher. Maybe you guys could say I have Trevor Sire a little bit high if his game sort of matches these two, but when we're talking about potential, I think we've seen the most from both Cozens and Coyle and not the most from Sire yet, so this is where I'm going to place these two in this tier, good but not elite. Next up, we have Michael Backlund. I think that Backlund belongs in this good player, fringe, second, third line player tier. When it comes to Backlund, right now, the Flames aren't exactly this exciting franchise to watch. They basically are using Nazem Kadri as their first line center, which just isn't a good look for any organization at this point in his career. And it's not to say that Backlund isn't a quality player. I just think that he's more of a third line player than he is a second line guy. I think when it comes to second line centers, you need to have guys who are consistent 60+ point scorers, and unfortunately, I'm just not sure if Backlund can be that for the Flames, especially with the line mates that he's going to have these next couple of seasons if he remains with the organization. I think he's a good player and will probably win most of his third line matchups, which is why I think he's a high quality third line center, but he's not a second line center to me, so this is where I'm going to place him. Next up, we have Jordan Staal. Sort of towards the end of his career, I think Staal also belongs in this sort of good player, fringe, second, third line center. It's not to say that his game isn't still pretty high quality. It's just to say that he's entering the kind of the final years of his career, and I don't think that with him as your second line center, you're really going to go far in today's NHL. He's definitely a little bit slower. He still has that high-end skill to be one of the better third line centers in the NHL, but if you have him as your second line center, I think at best he's maybe in the same tier as Coyle and Cousins, but at this point, I just don't think that I can place him on that same level. Obviously, he can be a second line center, and I think that if the Canes build around him in a nice way, it could potentially put him on that same level as Coyle and Cousins, but for right now, I think he's sort of on the same lines as Backlund, a very high quality third line center, and sort of a below average second line center. Next up, we have Casey Mittelstadt, a guy who I think belongs in the good but not elite tier. When it comes to Mittelstadt, I didn't really like him in Buffalo. I didn't feel like the fit was great, but in Colorado, I feel like he's being given the opportunity to take on a bigger role and maybe have some more success with the players that they have in their lineup versus Buffalo. Now, with Colorado having so much veteran experience and all of those guys who have won a cup already, I feel like they could definitely elevate Mittelstadt's game to a point where he's a very good second line center. Sort of like Coyle and Cousins, if he can just maintain around a 60-point year pace, then I think that he could be a good second line center for a Stanley Cup winning team. I'm going to leave him in this tier. I think some people might bump him down to the same one as Staal and Backlund, but I do feel like he's a little bit better than both of those two guys at this point in his career. Next up, we have Adam Fantilli, same as Logan Couture. I think he belongs in the on the rise tier. We had a good rookie season from Fantilli, but unfortunately he got hurt about halfway through, so we really didn't get to see his full potential. But from what I saw, the talent is clearly there with Fantilli, but we just need to see a little bit more. 1 year isn't enough of a sample size for me to grade him as a second line center in the NHL, and I think most of you guys can agree with that. So for right now, him and Couture, they're going to stay in the on the rise tier. I think there's a lot of potential there, but we just have to see a little bit more before we can make a solid ranking. Next up, we have Matt Duchene. I'm placing him in the same tier as Trevor Sire. I think he's easily one of the more underrated players in the NHL. Last year, he was asked to take on a lesser role with the Dallas Stars and still put up over 60 points, playing as their fringe second, third line center, depending on the night. He had some big moments in the regular season and the playoffs, and I think a lot of people underrate his game because he was bought out of his contract with Nashville, but don't let that fool you. He's still a very high quality center in the NHL, and I think that he's definitely capable of driving a team to a Stanley Cup as their second line guy. Next up, we have JT Compher. I'm going to put him in the good player, fringe second line guy. I think for Compher, I don't know. I just don't think that he's at that level of being a good but not elite center. I think that he's definitely more of a third line guy than a second line guy. I would like to see him take another step forward in his game. I do think that he's a high quality guy for the Red Wings based on their current situation. And if he has Vladimir Tarasenko and Patrick Kane as his wings, then I definitely could see him taking a step forward and putting up some better numbers. Do I think that he's going to be sort of the Stanley Cup driving guy as a second line center? I just don't think so. High quality player, very elite third line guy, but as a second line player, I think that he's just a little bit below average compared to some of the other guys that I have in the good but not elite tier. Next up, we have Leon Draisaitl. This one's easy. He should be a first-line center. Maybe outside of 2 or 3 teams, he's going to be the best player on any given roster. This one, I'm not even going to talk all that much about. He should be a top-line center, but playing with Connor McDavid, it makes sense why he's playing on their second line. Next up, we have Sam Bennett. I'm going to place him in this second tier. I think he's definitely capable of driving a team to a Stanley Cup as a second-line center. I think a lot of people underestimate his game because they don't remember he was actually taken pretty high in the NHL draft the year he was actually drafted, and maybe it's because he has a more physical style of play, that kind of ratty nature that he brings to a team that causes people to underestimate him, but I still think he's a very high quality center. He has some good playmaking abilities and knows how to finish in front of the net. I'm going to keep him in this second tier. I think he's definitely capable of being on the same level as about Matt Duchene and Trevor Zegras. Up next, we got Phillip Danault from the LA Kings. I think he's a good example of a good but not elite center. Quality second line guy. He gets the job done. He's consistent, elevates the play of his line mates, but I'm not sure if he's capable of really driving a team to a Stanley Cup. And don't get me wrong, I think that his play has kind of shown us enough to maybe consider him for that tier, which is why I sort of debated putting him in the one above versus the one that I'm placing him in now. But I do think that the LA Kings, I just need to see a little bit more from them. They can't keep getting bounced out in the first round and then have me say that Danault's a great high quality second line center that's been driving them to the Stanley Cup. It just doesn't really make sense. And maybe that's hypocritical if you look at the player like Trevor Sire being in the tier above him, but I just think that Philip Danault more aligns with the players in this tier versus the ones in that second tier like Duchene, Bennett, and Cizikas. I'm going to leave Danault here. Very good player, is consistent, and is high quality for the LA Kings, but I just can't really justify bumping him up any higher at this point. Next up, Marco Rossi. I actually think that Rossi belongs on the rise. I would like to see a little bit more from him. I think it still is a little bit too early in his career for me to make a very solid judgment on him. If I were to place him anywhere, I think I would actually put him here. I really like his game, and I think he's capable of elevating the Minnesota Wild to the next level. But again, sort of like the other guys in this tier, I feel like his career hasn't been long enough for me to make a solid judgment on the type of player that he actually is. So I'm going to leave Rossi kind of in this tier right here, maybe a season or two more just for me to get a better judgment of his game, but the potential is truly there with him. This kid is very talented and will be the future for the Minnesota Wild. Next up, Alex Newhook. I'm going to actually place him in this one as well. Well, maybe I'll place him here. I don't think that Alex Newhook is going to be a good second line center for an organization. We saw him get opportunities a little bit in Colorado, but then when he went to Montreal, you kind of saw the type of player that he is. Maybe a 40 to 50 point player, 60 at best, which I guess would be a good but not elite second line center, but still, maybe I want to see a little bit more from him. I want to see him take a step forward, especially when he's playing with other players as talented as that Montreal Canadiens young core. I just don't think I've seen enough from Newhook to really put him on the same page as some other guys who have been more consistent throughout their careers. So I'm going to place him here right now. He could be a good second line center, maybe a little below average, but I just don't see him being on the same tier as the other guys I have in the good but not elite one. Next up, Tommy Novak. I think he also belongs in this tier. I don't even think that he's going to be their second line center this year. I would have to look at the Nashville Predators, but let's hypothetically say that Novak's going to be playing alongside Stamkos and maybe March or so. Obviously, maybe he'll get a bump up if he's playing with those two players, but if he's playing with some normal average players on his line like he was the past couple of seasons, then I think that Novak is definitely more of a third line center than he is a second line center. Clearly, we saw that with Nashville last year. If they didn't have the high quality production from their top line, then I don't know if they would have even made the playoffs last season. That's how good those three players were compared to the rest of the roster. I think Nashville does need a little bit more help at the center position. Maybe that Marchessault and Stamkos addition will kind of aid them in that. But if Tommy Novak's their second line center, I think I'm feeling a little bit uneasy about him at that position. As a third line center though, I think he's very high quality. So I'm going to leave him in this tier with these other guys. Next up, Nico Hischier. I think that Nico Hischier is incredibly underrated. His game is very similar to a Patrice Bergeron, Anze Kopitar when they were kind of in their primes. Obviously, he's still incredibly young, a first overall pick a couple years back. The Devils have had some injuries these past couple of seasons, and Nico Hischier has definitely been involved in that. But when he's on the ice, I think he makes a big impact for the New Jersey Devils. And as their captain, I think that he's shown us a lot both on and off the ice for us to consider him being a pretty high quality second line guy, especially when he's playing behind a player like Jack Hughes. I've actually seen Nico Hischier even play on the top line sometimes where they move Jack Hughes down for a more favorable matchup. But between the two, I think Nico Hischier is sort of a fringe top line second line guy. So I'm going to keep him in this tier. Definitely the ceiling is there for him, but maybe we can see a little bit more once the Devils are in the playoffs these next couple of seasons with the roster that they've built. Brock Nelson is up next. I think he's a good but not elite second line center. Obviously, Brock has been in the league for a minute. He's been pretty consistent and has had some pretty good highlights with the New York Islanders, but with the Islanders' lack of playoff success, I think that I can't really justify putting him a tier above. We've seen the Islanders go on some deep runs, and I just have never really noticed Brock Nelson being that difference maker on their roster as they go through a couple of those rounds. So I'm going to place him in this tier right here. He's a pretty good leader for the team. He definitely has his moments, but when I think about high quality second line centers, I don't think I ever consider Brock Nelson to be a name that's brought up in my head. So I'm going to leave him in this tier. I think he's a good player, but just not elite to me at this moment. Next up, I got Vincent Trocheck. I actually think that he should be a first-line center and could be a first-line center for a team that's competing for a Stanley Cup. Some people might disagree, but I think that Trocheck's game is actually really sound. Whether he was underestimated in Florida, Carolina, and even sometimes in New York, he shows up in big moments. He's a very good leader for this organization, and he rounds out their top six perfectly right now in New York. Now, I could see Trocheck being a top center for a lot of teams in the NHL, which is why I'm going to place him in this tier. Even with the New York Rangers, I think that some could argue he's been a better center than Mika Zibanejad at some points. He's going to go in this tier. It's not to say that he's on the same level as Leon Draisaitl in any way, but he definitely could be a top line center for a lot of teams in the NHL that are competing for a playoff spot. Next, we have Shane Pinto, a player who I think is definitely on the rise. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see him play all that much last season because he got suspended for 41 games. But something about Pinto that people don't talk about enough is his defensive skills, which I think is important for any second line center in the NHL, as well as his skill offensively that he just really hasn't tapped into yet because he hasn't been on the ice enough for him to really experiment with his play style. I really like Pinto, and like the other guys in this tier, I think he's on the rise, and if Ottawa can finally just get everything together, I think he's going to be a big part to them making the playoffs if they do this upcoming season. Next up, we have Morgan Frost, the first guy going in my not a second line center tier. It was tough because I feel like you could make the argument that he belongs in this tier with maybe Tommy Novak and then Alex Newhook, but I just think from what I've seen from him, and especially towards the end of the year last year with Philadelphia, he's only getting second line minutes because they just don't really have any other options right now. And if he's playing alongside guys like Michkov and Tippett, then sure, maybe his game will elevate, but I just don't think that he's elevating the players that he plays with when he's on that second line. I think he'll definitely have some favorable matchups as a third line center and could be a high quality guy there, but as a second line guy, I just don't really see it. I'm going to place him in the not a second line center tier. Maybe if he continues to develop and can show me differently, then I'll place him higher, but for right now, I think this is a good spot for him. Next up, Evgeni Malkin. I think at this point in his career, he's a good but not elite second line center. Will he be a second line center for most teams? Maybe. About 15 teams in the NHL if you kind of look at each one individually and see if he's a good fit. But even with the Pittsburgh Penguins, I don't feel like he's good in that role anymore. Now, in his prime, he would have been in this tier up here with Draisaitl and Trocheck. But right now, I think we all can agree that his game has definitely regressed a little bit. And for anybody to consider him being higher with the Penguins missing the playoffs now back-to-back seasons, it just kind of feels like a joke at that point. Or maybe you're just paying him respect for what he's done in the past. I think that he belongs in this tier right here. He's still a solid second line guy, but is he capable of driving a team to a Stanley Cup? I'm not so sure anymore, so I'm going to leave him in this tier right here. Next up, we have Luke Coonan. I don't think he's a second line center at all. We all saw how the Sharks performed last year. They're a bottom barrel team and they barely had a first line center last year, let alone a second line guy. He's a third, fourth line guy. That's the perfect example for him, so I'm going to leave him in this tier right here. Next up, Jared McCain. I think I'm going to put him in the good but not elite tier. I'm not the biggest fan of Seattle's offense or their system, but I do think that McCann has shown us enough to place him in this same tier with some of the other guys that I have right here. He definitely knows how to score, make some plays, and kind of elevate his line mates a little bit, but I just don't think that Seattle has enough playing on his wings right now to kind of justify placing him any higher. I would love to see him on a team that has some better top 6 players than Seattle, if that makes sense, to see where he can kind of elevate his game to. But in the current system that he is in right now and his production over the past couple of years, I think he's definitely a good second line center, but not an elite one at this point. Next up, Brayden Schenn, sort of the same as Jared McCann. I feel like if you could get him a couple better line mates, maybe we could see a little bit more out of him. I don't think that he's terrible. I think he's fine, but with the Blues just kind of being an average team right now, I can't justify placing him any higher. If this team's top line center can't get him into the playoffs, I'm not sure if their second line player is doing all that much to convince me otherwise. Sort of like McCann, maybe it's more about the system and the players around him, but I have Brayden Schenn in this tier right here. He's a good second line center, but is he capable of leading them to a Stanley Cup? I'm not so sure. Next up, we have Anthony Cirelli. I'm going to place him in the good but not elite tier. I think when you're playing in a system like the Tampa Bay Lightning one, you're always going to have a pretty solid game, or else you probably wouldn't be making the lineup. But regardless, I think playing without Stamkos this year will be a little bit of a change for him. He still does have Hagel, who is a good line mate, so I can see him still putting up some similar numbers. He's consistent, he's responsible, and he's just a good second line center. Is it enough at this point in his career for him to be good enough to lead the Lightning to a Stanley Cup? I'm not so sure, but I'm going to leave him in this tier, give him some respect. The guy's been very solid for Tampa Bay over the past couple of seasons. Next up, we have John Tavares. I think a lot of people at one point would have placed him in this tier, but right now in his career, I think this is the perfect category for him. He just had his captaincy taken away, and I think a lot of people give him some discredit for how he left New York and then playing for a team like Toronto that most fan bases hate. But if you look at his numbers, he's been pretty consistent throughout his tenure with that organization. And I think at this point, if Toronto could just get out of their own way and surround this talented forward core with a better defense and some more reliable goaltending, then he he would be the perfect second line center for any Stanley Cup team. I'm going to leave him in this tier. He definitely needs to prove himself a little bit more when it comes to the postseason, but I think that's more about Toronto than his game. I still think he's capable of driving a team to a Stanley Cup as a second line center though. Next up, JT Miller. This one's easy for me. He belongs in the should be a top line center, and I'm actually pretty sure that he plays that top line role for the Vancouver Canucks over Elias Pettersson. But let's just say that he's on the second line. I think for almost any team in the NHL outside of a few, he would be their top line center. He's shown us that he's been one of the more underrated and consistent centers in the game, and topping 100 points as a second line guy easily puts you in this tier. Maybe you guys could say I have Vincent Trocheck a little bit too high. Maybe we'll have to revisit that at the end. But I think JT Miller belongs perfectly in this same category as Draisaitl and Trocheck right now. Next up, we have Chandler Stevenson, but in reality, since he was traded to Seattle, this is going to be Tomas Hertl. For Hertl, I think that he's a good but not elite second line center. I would like to see a little bit more from him. I didn't get to see him play all that much with Vegas last year, and I didn't watch enough Sharks hockey to really get a good image of him. He was fine as their first line center, but obviously it wasn't doing enough for them to be considered a contender or make the playoffs. So I guess what does that tell you about his game? Maybe he'll look good in Vegas playing alongside guys like Stone, but at this point, I can't really justify putting Hertl any higher. I do think he's a high quality player and will probably be more likely in this tier after I get to see him play a little bit with Vegas. But at this point, I think this is the perfect way to describe Hertl. Let's see a little bit more. Let's see him be healthy and play for an organization that's actually making the playoffs right now. Next up, we have Henri Lapier. I don't think that he's a second line center in any way. For Washington, I think they're probably going to slot PLD in that role this year, or Dylan Strome, depending on how they build their lines. But for me, Lapier, he's not in that category. I don't think he's a good second line center. He's sort of an average third line guy to me, so I'm going to leave him in this tier. It's no disrespect, but I think he just needs a lesser role in order to put up some better productive numbers. And last but not least, Sean Monahan, who actually was traded to the Columbus Blue Jackets. So this will be Vladislav Nemestikov for the Jets instead. That's who's projected to be their second line center right now, according to Daily Faceoff. So I'm going to place him in this tier right here. I'm just not sure if this is going to work out for the Jets. I actually really liked Monahan as their second line center, and it was a bit disappointing to me that they couldn't retain him or re-sign him after a pretty good season from him this past season. But I think when it comes to Nemestikov, I need to see a little bit more from him. Hopefully he can gel well with that top six in Winnipeg, but I think for right now, he's a good player, fringe second, third line guy, more of a third line center than a second line center to me at this point. But this is my final list right here. Cole Sillinger, for some reason, was added into this tier list, but we have Adam Fantilli on this list, so we don't need two Columbus guys. So I'll just throw him in this tier right here because I feel like if he was their second line center, this is probably where I would put him too. The only one thing that I want to change about this list is I do think that Vincent Trocheck maybe needs to be bumped down a little bit. I might have been a little bit over eager with his kind of prediction and where I think he ranks in the NHL. He probably is a better second line center than a first line center for most teams. And when I put him in this tier with JT Miller and Leon Draisaitl, he definitely was the oddball in that one. For this second tier, I do think I need to bump Trevor Zegras down to the on the rise thing. I think if I'm talking about players and what we've seen so far, I can't just project out for Trevor Zegras if I'm not doing that for other players. So to be consistent in this tier list, I do feel like Trevor Zegras needs to come down a bit, even though I like his game and I think the potential's there. But for my first tier, I really like these two players. The second tier, I think that this is a perfect thing. Maybe Sam Bennett wants to come down for me too. He looks like an oddball for this tier. The third tier, I think this is perfect, especially when we move Bennett down. I think this makes a lot more sense. On the rise, these are all the young guys who we haven't seen enough from. This tier right here, this is the perfect one. I don't think any of these guys are really second line centers. Maybe JT Compher could be bumped up a little bit because I do feel like he stands out, but I'm going to leave him here because I do think that I need to see a little bit more from him. And then this last tier, these three guys are definitely not second line centers to me. But let me know what you guys think. What would you change about my list? What would you keep? Drop your thoughts in the comments below as always. Make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.